Um,
Yeah, cool. Before I start, do you want our vetoes?
Oh, I've never got your vetoes in the chat. So you guys are doing motion one and you've both vetoed motion three, right?
Yeah.
Awesome, got it.
And I'll assume I can be open to that. All right, let me just put my paper together. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think what you care about most in this scenario is not only the fact that you are trying to maintain your buy-in and sponsorships, but as this captain, you probably just want to be able to sleep at night. And this is an incredibly morally important issue. And I think there are a bunch of different reasons as to why this is probably the best way that you can conform with your own morality, but also that you get the best possible buy-in from all of the different actors, including your team, including the nation you play in and the nation you live in. I think that is why this is an incredibly important thing to do. Let's start by establishing the incentives of this actor and giving some important characterization. Then I'll explain why you get buy-in from the country you live and play in, considering that it's 2 countries. Then I'll talk about how you get buy-in from the people that you play with and why these negative impacts that possibly may accrue are likely to be incredibly small. Okay, what are the incentives of the actor? I think first of all, it's important to establish that that the captain of the Welsh team, Gareth Bale, is in his twilight years. I think that means he likely wants buy-in and sponsorship, but note that this is like mechanistically true that generally all players would want some level of sponsorship and buy-in, given that's their way of gathering capital. But also note that given that twilight years, this is probably the only way in order to do that. The second thing is that you want the team, like the place that you come from, to be happy with your decision. You want to get some level of buy-in from them, and you care about the Welsh people being happy. Thirdly, you probably just want to be consistent with your own beliefs. Okay, let's actually give this some important characterization of what Gareth Bale, this captain, actually looks like. First thing to note here is that he is the forward for Wales. What that means for this debate is that currently the punishment of being booked means getting a yellow card from FIFA. What this actually means with a forward, they are the statistically least likely to get a yellow card, which means, and also noting that getting 2 yellow cards is what means you get sent off. So I think like statistically, this is already like a lower likelihood of him being sent off in the first place. That's an important piece of characterization. The second thing to say is that he lives in Wales and requires that high buy-in from there. I think, and that's probably also again just mechanistically true, regardless of like who that captain could potentially be, given that they would have represented that country multiple times, and also the fact that he's considered the leader of that team. So therefore, obviously, he wants buy-in from that country. The third thing to say is that he also plays for LA, but again, also structurally true that many players play both for their country as the national representative, but also play for other leagues in different countries, which is to say that he would also require like a level of buy-in from that country that he played in as well. I think that we can explain this debate in the context of this specific actor, Gareth Bale. We can also explain it structurally in terms of the fact that you would want this level of support regardless of what that context looked like in terms of structural mechanism. Okay, why is it likely that you get buy-in from both the country that your home country, Wales, and the country that you play in, which is the US and specifically LA? I think the first thing to characterize here is that Wales is an incredibly progressive place. We'd note, for example, they have things like equality, and they've had that since 2014. Also, they have pride parades in Cardiff like basically every year. And also we've considered that just generally most countries where you have like significant football leagues are likely to be fairly progressive, given they have the resources to do all of that. So I think that means you are likely to incur incredibly low backlash. You probably get a lot of support from that country when you do this. I think the second important mechanism here is that you dispel the narrative that has continually been asked in like interviews about like, well, how do you justify playing considering these like awful human rights abuses, which is to say, they say, well, we're just doing it like for the sport. We're just here to play football. That is obviously an incredibly bad narrative. Your country is relatively progressive, and this shows, by doing this, you show that you have some level of values and that you care about more than just like your professional success and career. Obviously that is a good thing and why you would get buy-in. The third thing to say is the third mechanism here is why it is incredibly unlikely to be viewed as tokenistic. And there are 4 reasons for that. Firstly, given the fact that a bunch of other teams have pulled out from this, all other teams who are proposed to have pulled out, this means this is going to be seen as a far braver move than if everyone was doing it, because you are actually actively going against what FIFA has required. The second thing to say is that the media attention you are going to get is going to be incredibly positive. I think especially in like left-wing media where like the reporting on Qatar has been incredibly negative, this provides a very good counter narrative for that. So you're probably likely to get very good attention there. Third thing to say here is that the label of tokenistic is usually only applied to things that are done without thought and things that are incredibly common. Obviously, this is a very uncommon thing to do, but also it's notable that you've had to clearly put in a lot of thought to do it because of the fact that, like the fact that this could result in like potentially your team doing a little bit worse. The fourth thing to say is, even if this was tokenistic, obviously that doesn't harm you because no one's reputation is ever harmed by being claimed they're tokenistic. Maybe like some right-wing tabloid says that. Obviously, you don't particularly care about that. And also, this probably, regardless, still probably helps some kids who feel like they're represented, even if it's a tiny bit tokenistic. The impact of this point is that you improve your perception in Wales. You also improve your perception in the other country in LA where you play, and that is obviously incredibly important. But also important to hear just to give some level of context in terms of like what Gareth Bale's actual playing history looks like. I think first of all, the fact that he plays in LA and lives there, when that is an incredibly progressive place, where that has had like the first American queer footballer, Robbie Rogers, and also he would get an insane amount of support from the fact that he has done this here, and that will probably look like things like a huge amount of fans, a number of interviews, which obviously increases his ability to gather capital in the future. Also sponsorships, which again is really important when you're in your twilight years as a player and you have no other way to gather capital later. Yeah, so that is an important piece of context there. The impact of this is immense. Firstly, because you get those sponsors and buy-in. As I've already said, twilight years is the only way to get that capital. The second thing is just generally football is fairly egotistical, and the amount of positive attention this garners from both the countries that you work in is something that they're very likely to be appreciated, that they would very likely appreciate. And the third thing is that you just generally feel good about yourself because you feel like you are morally consistent. You can actually sleep at night because you feel like you've supported something that is likely to be very important to you given the place that you come from. Okay, why does this increase buy-in not only with your country, but the people that you play with and the team that you are on? Okay, firstly, you are likely why this is going to be good for your team. Firstly, the leader of that team. But the second thing, and probably very important here, is this particular World Cup has attracted a significant amount of controversy, which has resulted in a lot of teams being asked extremely difficult questions in interviews. Obviously, that is very difficult because those questions are often sprung on you, so media training is not particularly effective. But also, like, there is nothing good you can say when you're asked about, like, well, what do you think about how, like, Qatar supports or how, Qatar violates the rights of queer people? Like, there is no good justification you can give to that, especially when you come from a relatively progressive country. And this is something that the media is incredibly likely to ask and has asked because of the fact that this is so controversial. The impact here is to take the spotlight off this team. That is because when you interview them about political, that is because you are just less likely to interview that team about those political issues, and they'll only ask like you, the captain. But the second thing is, to the extent they do ask the team about those issues, they only ask them about like, well, what do you think about your captain supporting this? And that's much easier to answer because you can just be like, oh, of course we support. Oh, yeah, you're also very unlikely to encounter any backlash from this teammate because we would say largely they have some level of ideological support for you. That is again because Wales is a very progressive country, but also to the extent that like they aren't supportive of queer people, that is probably something that they would already have to cop anyways because like these clubs already make them like make supportive statements or participate in pride events. Obviously, that is no worse on our side than would be in the status quo. The impact here is also incredibly important. That is because these people are your friends and you interact with the most. You also, and secondly, important here for team cohesion, which probably affects how well you play. Okay, why are the negative impacts really small? First thing is this will have very little effect on your performance. Again, as I've told you as a forward, you are unlikely to get sent off because you won't get a second yellow card. Second thing is that worst case here, Wales has replacements anyways in that area. For example, Daniel James, so that would have a very low impact even if you were sent off. Thirdly, you're probably likely to make it out of your group anyway because like there are a bunch of weak teams in there, including Iran and the US, which has never made a final, so you'll make it out anyways. Even if you didn't, Wales never wins the World Cup, so they probably don't care that much if you lose, and this is something that is far more.
I thank First affirmative for that speech and welcome first negative to begin next case.
Hello, am I audible? All right.
Actually, one moment. I'm going to turn on the light because it's so dark. All right, I'm back. First, Ned, when you're ready.
All right. So just reiterating, gender pronouns needed. Starting my speech. So the clash coming from opposition is clear. We are not going to wear the One Love armband. We are going to continue to play, not make any statements regarding this. We are just going to play the game of football with the rest of the team. A couple of responses before I move on to the case. First, their side wanted to downplay the risk of your performance by saying that this is just one yellow card. Two responses. One, we think that this is one of many range of options that the FIFA authorities can do. I'm going to later outline what other possible things that they can do and prove why it's actually likely that you could get sent off. But two, even if it doesn't, we think that it does have an effect in terms of your psyche and your ability to play the game because of the fact that there are going to be external influences of like the paparazzi after you, media, again, and other parts that are within the argument. The second thing that they wanted to place, they're going to be applauded by a lot of these fans. Two responses. One, okay, they may be progressive like your Wales citizens, but this is going to be the first time where sports and like progressivism is put in a trade-off. We think that the vast majority of the Welsh audience actually prefer sports over like being LGBTQ plus because of the fact that oftentimes they're dedicated and socialized into believing that football is the thing that you should be doing as a citizen of that like region. But second of all, we think that the football community isn't necessarily the progressive community here, right? Like you're making the assertion that you're going to be getting support from your fans or you're getting support from like your other like teammates, but there's no guarantee that they are also like pro-queer in these cases. We assert that they aren't because oftentimes a lot of these football clubs are held like by toxic masculine men that probably don't share the same progressive beliefs as you. The last thing that I wanted to say is that, well, you're going to be treated well in interviews. You could just spin it off in terms of like a simple answer to a question. We think that's unrealistic given the fact that it's literally the World Cup, like one of the biggest international sporting events in the world. We think it's unlikely that you're just going to be held up by one interview. It's probably going to be many. Moving on to the case. First argument, we think that this jeopardizes your prospects in the World Cup and everyone else that you have an obligation to. And I want to make this argument very clear because we think that it is an interest of the athlete to prioritize the game of football because it's more than just a game to you. You dedicated your entire life around the game of football. You also build your entire networks and friends with the Welsh team. You have a deep sense of national and regional pride from the taste of being close to the trophy, given the fact that this is an event that only happens once every 4 years. And this isn't a tournament that you have won or at least in like recent decades, right? The problem specifically with wearing the armband is that it impedes in your ability to properly play well and your ability to appease your own fans, to appease your own teammates within the sport. Why? Because there are two scenarios that exist in the debate. One where you're sent off and one where you are sent off. We think that this is a likely chance of this happening. Why? Because one, there are explicit statements from Sepp Blatter, the president of FIFA, stating, denouncing the fact of you wanting to promote this thing in the first place. There's massive power asymmetry given that you're the captain while this is literally the president of an organization. But second of all, we think that Qatari authorities can step in at any moment, right? Because of Article 296, where they can like send them off and they endorse this behavior because they do things like criminalizing, although we like aren't going to engage in risk case that they will be criminalized, but in this case just sent off because of like quote unquote inducing homosexuality, right? Like even the Emir of Qatar said that they have to respect the culture. This is specifically what Tamim bin Hamad said. But let's assume the best case scenario, one where they aren't set off in the first place. We think that this is still bad for you because of one, there's a looming threat that you could be sent off. So there's still a great sense of anxiety in the next game, in the third game, fourth game, fifth game from being able to play. Second, you're also going to be harassed and held up by media and paparazzi, which means that you probably are going to be incredibly preoccupied and may not play the next future games because of how much controversy that you're sparked. Additionally, this also creates undue pressure on your teammates as well. Let's buy into what their side want to say. If you're going to get interviews, you're going to get a series of interviews every time, right? Like, take a look at, for instance, like Hans Niemann. He was held up for that cheating scandal, for instance, every single time, even though it wasn't like related to like his previous tournaments, for instance. But fourth, we think that you're going to get like massive anxiety as well from the audience reaction. The fact that everyone is going to be staring at you in terms of your shoulder instead of actually at the game. Why is this particularly problematic? Because we think that, number one, it throws you off your game. Because you, as the captain, Gareth Bale, are the mastermind, all right? Because you're one of the starting 6 players that could have been like a striker, a goalkeeper, and beat gets sent off, regardless of scenario. The spirit and the morale of the team is going to be lost because they're going to have the looming threat, like belief of activism behind their minds, making it so that they're going to be thrown off their game at that point, right? Which is going to be incredibly bad because you destroy the connections that you have on your own teammates as a result of being the person that put all this immense pressure on them. Two, you piss off the entire Welsh community and headlines because now they're going to tie the loss for your game to the fact that you wore the armband. And three, yeah, you just lose, right? So it impedes in your ability to, actually do the interesting what you want, which is playing the game. Here's the weighing. Why is this more important than the ability to be an activist coming from like affirmative? One, intensity, because you chose to be an athlete first over being an activist. Right? Take note. The reason why you didn't want to wear the armband in the first game is because the hesitancy stated in the info slide, like assumes and implies a revealed preference that they would rather prioritize their own incentive to want to be a good athlete. Second of all, in terms of a sense of moral culpability, take note, if you don't wear the armband, you're not going to blame yourself being the reason why the LGBT community doesn't get any amount of support, right? Because, it's probably Qatar's fault and not yours, versus the sense of moral culpability and guilt that you feel from from losing in that game in the first place. So we think that there's an asymmetric amount of guilt that you face when you are sent off or not sent off. But third, this is literally your only chance to be able to compete in the World Cup versus, there are many other opportunities where you can help the LGBT community in the form of like private donations and stuff, which means that you can still get the benefit of wanting to help the community on either side. Second argument, why this damages the long-run prospects of your career. We think that the thesis of this argument is that oftentimes you're going to be perceived as a volatile actor because they're going to think that and attribute that armband to a loss, given the first argument that I mentioned, which is going to be incredibly bad, right? Because now you're no longer probably going to be sent sponsors anymore because you're going to be perceived as unprofitable, right? As a volatile person, you're probably not going to be captain anymore and being able to play in future FIFA games because the national team perceives you as a person that chokes and isn't going to be put in the spotlight properly. You're also never probably going to be able to play in your own football club, which that can be an activist and like not be able to properly play in those games as a result of like you not being good, right? Like a good example of this would be Colin Kaepernick. Like he is like after his like knee in like the US anthem, he's still not playing as a quarterback anymore in that version of football, not this version of football, right? Which means that this is going to be incredibly bad for you. Like this is an irreversible decision. Take note that even if you may be an activist now, and here's where I engage with weighing, like you can't make this decision for yourself in the future in 4 years to 10 years time, where you probably still prioritize football, right? Like we think that this is going to be incredibly bad in the long term, in the long run, even if it means having to trade off like your short run willingness of wanting to help the community, given again you dedicate your entire life to the sport and is going to impede on your ability to actually want to play the game that you do so dearly love. For those reasons, negative.
I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that speech and welcome second affirmative to continue App's case.
Very sorry. It's just like Small table. I am going. Firstly, I want to engage in wing because they clearly never engage in our side. They have 3 claims here. 1, you choose to be an athlete and not an activist. But we explain actually that football careers come to an end. That eventually you need to public eye because presumably you can sail through, but you want to be able to constantly be in the media's eye. But thirdly, in the specific context of this being Gareth Bale, which they never contend, Gareth Bale is currently like 36. His footballing days are at an end, which necessarily means this is in his mind's eye. The fact that he wants to switch to activism as quickly as he possibly can, as opposed to necessarily maintain in football. Their second claim is that you have an amount of culpability and guilt. Firstly, this is clearly uncomparative. You anyway have huge amounts of pressure of you at the captain of the Welsh team, but also because you've just been in so many other finals. The context for this is obviously that Gareth Bale has played for example, Real Madrid, who's a very big club. So he probably has experience with this sort of stuff. But even if you don't buy that context, you are the captain, you probably have huge amounts of pressures, and all the narratives that they want us to just lying on you, they need to prove why this is the tipping point, why you have never experienced this sort of pressure ever before in your life, and why this is specifically the thing that makes you break. But we give you mechanisms as to why you probably are able to. I would note also that footballers anyway just like take drugs, with like not like illegal drugs, but they take anxiety reducing drugs before a match to sort of mitigate these sort of impacts because they know the amount of pressure that footballers have on them. But all they say is that people will instead be watching you on the armband. I would flip this and say that it's incredibly good. People support you. Every time you get the ball, everyone screams, hey! Every time they know that you are Gareth Bale, you get love from the fans, and you know that you are likely to be supported in this situation, which means its culpability and guilt point is lost. Ridiculous. Their last claim is you are volatile. I will note this is innately countered by the characterization that this is a short-term harm as opposed to necessarily when in the future you're likely to, for example, go into activism. But couple of responses. Firstly, sponsorships 100% want you to have this. They give the example of Colin Kaepernick. I think Colin Kaepernick's doing pretty bloody well for himself right now, has huge amounts of sponsorship deals with Nike, for example, constantly doing media interviews and constantly in the mind's eye, constantly making money. It's unclear to me why this is a harm. He's sinking on a bed of money. But the second claim is it's unclear as to how necessarily this buggers over your own clubs, because they never give any mechanism as to why the volatility of you choosing to wear the armband necessarily translates into the club. I would note that firstly, this is a decision that many people have discussed. This is one that has lots of discussions, which means it's not something completely out of the blue. It's one that's reasonable for these players to have and do. Secondly, but I would note that it's unclear how you necessarily do this in the club. Like, what do they think that our clubs are now going to perceive you of like wearing an entirely different kit to a match in order to show activism? Truly ridiculous. But also that doesn't characterize the fact that many clubs anyway have forms of activism from players that they allow. Like for example, in Crystal Palace, Michy Batshuayi did not kneel for like the BLM initially because of the fact that he thought that was tokenistic. Necessarily that means that clubs are fine with you doing this. It's unclear why this volatility point they say has any impact. But we explain the fact that firstly, in the context of Gareth Bale, you are at the end of your career and you want as much as you can to have that cushy life so that you can provide for your family, so you can provide for your friends, so that you can just live a positive life, stay in the mind's eye, keep feeding that ego. But even if you don't explain that, the fact that footballing careers are short, they are incredibly volatile. You don't know whether one season you're going to be kicked out or undergone by the next best player, which necessarily means that it's unclear why this changed. I would note then the only mechanism they give as to any of the impacts that we have is that you are likely to have negative impacts done against you in terms of this has negative impacts on the match. That is their only win condition. We can still win even in that scenario is not there by our way. So let's talk about then the negative impacts that they say and discuss. We anyway explain that in our worst case scenario, Wales never qualifies particularly far in the World Cup. It's unclear to me why the Welsh population is like really addicted to this as opposed to well, we'll get them next time or whatever. They never explain why football, or specifically World Cup football, and making it further is so incredibly important to Wales. But importantly, they never responded to the fact that you probably don't jeopardize them. You have players that can play in your position. For example, Danielle James. It's unclear why specifically this buggers you over. Now, let's discuss their responses to this. Their first thing is to just say that there is a range of options. I don't want to make a big deal about this, but the info side is wrong. Germany's captain already did this and actually was given a yellow card. So presumably they have to standardize the impact of this because of the fact that otherwise it would be unfair or directed towards individual people. But even if you don't believe that claim and we buy whatever the info site says, we explain that other people are probably likely to side is mitigated by that. Why are other people likely to to go with you? Firstly, the fact that Bale is well loved as a player. He played for very large clubs of Real Madrid. Even if you don't believe that context, he's a captain. He probably has played for like good clubs in a club context, which means he has international support. It's not just support from Wales. Secondly, the fact that other nations are probably likely to follow suit. How do you think it's going to respond when, for example, the Netherlands captain asks, why aren't you wearing your Gareth? Don't do anything about it, which means necessarily they have to follow suit into this. Otherwise, it looks incredibly poor on them as an individual. Becomes a negative action for them not to enter into this. That means that large countries are likely to have this. But note the countries in this group: Netherlands, England, Wales, Germany. All these are very big players in the World Cup. You can't, but FIFA is physically unable to have huge amounts of impacts towards these individuals. Otherwise, you lose a large amount of the market that was going to be watching the FIFA World Cup. This explanation necessarily suggests the action taken against Gareth Bale is likely to be incredibly small, probably just a red card. Let's talk about their first claim is that Qatar is likely to come down on you. Firstly, these are mechanisms put in place by specifically the World Cup because there are many concessions to go to, like for example, that Qatar has made. I would note also that like homosexual PDA, I'm pretty sure is actually legal if you're attending the World Cup, which necessarily means that Qatar is fine to make these concessions, has to otherwise. They only claim is that Sepp Blatter wants to do it and be strict on you. But I would note that this is actually the tipping point in terms of how FIFA reacts, because so far every single protest has just been external stuff, but there's no impact to the actual game of football. This is the first time you have an impact to the game. Somebody gets a yellow card and that impacts how individuals play that game, which necessarily means that this is probably going to be the tipping point for a lot of nations. This is probably going to be the tipping point at which Sepp Blatter realizes I can't be as assertive. I need to just deal with the fact that this thing is happening to me, because otherwise the impacts on the game are likely to do things like mar the Qatar World Cup far, far greater. Imagine the backlash that would have to FIFA if Wales doesn't qualify because of the fact that they were just standing up for something that's pretty reasonable by people. That probably means that you have things like more investigations into FIFA and their organizations, which necessarily means that it's not in its incentives. There are other claims as to why you're likely to play well, poorly. Firstly, interviews being held up. It's unclear why you can't just reject interviews or go away. People understand you're playing in a World Cup and you probably have better things to do with your life. But also, these interviews are going to be largely positive. They're going to be ones worshiping you, saying you did excellent, well done for doing that. The mechanisms that need better, which means it's not perceived as tokenistic by other individuals. But secondly, the media's current stance is that people should do this, which necessarily means it's one that they want to firstly provide a win for the left because of the fact that World Cup is so negative. But secondly, it's one that they can't track back on. These explanations say that probably it is unlikely that your game is explicitly affected on their side. The only other mechanisms that they might give is then like impacting of the other stuff. But we effectively outweigh that by explaining that the buy-in from other claim is that there is a slight chance that, for example, the attention is directed towards, like, for example, like the sport fan and the LGBTQ fan isn't there. Firstly. Secondly, many clubs anyway do this under the status quo. This isn't something individual to the World Cup. Many clubs, for example, the entire Premier League has the One Love armband that people wear, which necessarily means that people are probably fine with that intersection of sport and politics. Unclear why. But thirdly, the fact that this is something to be proud of, the media attention around it, even if in Wales is bad, around it is likely to be positive. Worst comes to worst, the only other thing they say that the football community is like anti-LGBT. We expect panel in our worst case scenario we still won, but I still haven't proven why this has bad impacts. So proud.
I'd like to thank Second Affirmative for that speech and welcome Second Negative to continue the team's case.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Luigi Alcaneses. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. So my argument today is gonna be very simple. I'm gonna explain why volunteering to become a figurehead is very draining for this individual. Before this, a few points of response that I want to make. So the first thing I want to point out is the strategy of the previous speaker and previous team, because I think they rely significantly on a lot of asserted mitigations on the immediate impact of wearing this armband. So I really will try to go through one by one and explain why these are ineffective mitigations to disprove our first speaker's point that it will be a substantial impact that causes a lot of anxiety, a lot of pressure, that will, or even uncertainty, that would likely impact your performance in significant ways, your own hard work, celebrity status that this particularly provides. So let's go to the mitigations now. Number one, you will get 1 yellow card. So again, the policy is that you will get a booking for each instance in which you wear this armband. So you will inevitably get 2 yellow cards when you play in the next group stage game. And the tension that is created in the middle period between the first and second booking will make it harder for you to cooperate and work with your teammates. So it still proves our point, because we still prove that most of your teammates may not necessarily be progressive as well, or may not necessarily be as hardline in the belief that they want to be as progressive or support this cause, because they also have their own pursuits. And again, the structural reason behind this is that most of these individuals did not grow up being activists or being engaged with the LGBT community, because many of these individuals also most likely grew up in toxic masculine communities of all male-dominated football teams, because even in Wales, those can still exist. Number two, there are substitutes. Losing a starting player immediately makes it much harder to develop set plays that some specialized players are known for, which Gareth Bale is probably known for as well. And losing a team decisions that are also relevant. And again, a yellow card or 2 yellow cards or being suspended from a game or not playing and getting in a substitute instead substantially impacts team chemistry in significant ways, because you also have to change the playing time of multiple other people. And that's unnecessary added stress and pressure that most teams are not prepared for if this decision is happening during the middle of the World Cup. Number 3, you will likely get out of the group stages anyways. I'm not so sure if this is proven to be true. Teams, as they proved, because Wales has historically been uncompetitive in the final stages, are probably improving significantly with more money, like Qatar is doing very, very well. Iran is also doing very, very well as well. Fourthly, it doesn't matter if Wales doesn't win the World Cup anyways. Again, I agree, it doesn't really matter if they win or they don't, regardless. But I think what we proved in our argument is that the fact that this loss or potential difficulty in winning may be tied to your activism in an immense pressure environment is regret that is strongly tied to you, and responsibility you as a captain assigned to yourself. And therefore, it makes it harder for you to objectively evaluate your career legacy after the fact or after this tournament is done. So if it's true, Wales does not win, even more you will credit your losses in this tournament to the fact that you chose this activist position that somehow made it harder for you to be in this position. What's the other one? The next one they said in the previous speaker is you can use anxiety-reducing drugs, and you are able to get love from the fans when you get the ball because they'll cheer for you. Well, this is not necessarily true in the FIFA World Cup itself in Qatar, since a vast majority of football fans may not applaud you. They said that PDA for homosexuals is allowed in the FIFA World Cup, and then applauding you every single time you get the ball, because most of them are not Wales fans. Most of them are also probably not progressive and liberal for the structural reasons my previous speaker provided to you, and thus you're not going to get the immediate sense of relief you might want. Lastly, they said another captain in Germany did this, and it's also very progressive. This is unlike those and how sponsorship determined this calculus, because I think this is more overwhelming and more persuasive than this idea that on a political macro scale that most governments will support you because sponsorships are more approximate and therefore they affect you more realistically. This is unlikely because FIFA sponsorships are very influential in these communities, and most football fans clamor for political neutrality because they care more about nationalism, they care more about pride for winning for their nation. And this is very true for a lot of nations and a lot of male-dominated fan bases who are also not generally inclined to take activist positions in favor of homosexuals. Even in the best case, this does not necessarily change how the immediate fallout works in the World Cup, and thus even if you have some sponsors, it's not going to change your prospect. Their claim is that Gareth Bale wants to become an activist, and it's attempting to spend his last few years cushion for his career. That FIFA World mean that this is an opportunity to give up your prospect of trying your best, it means that this is also your last opportunity to pursue creating a lasting legacy for your career in terms of potential successes, going very far, instead of dreaming to be an activist and therefore assigning your blame or your responsibility on that basis, especially in the case of Gareth Bale, because he himself does not identify as part of the LGBTQ community. I think this is important to flag because he might not feel that he's a good enough representative, and thus the burden of being an activist position is also one that he's not willing to also shoulder too. But lastly, the success of being an activist and sponsorship is largely asserted. The structural mechanism of controversy proves the example of why Colin Kaepernick eventually led to mass losses in revenue for Nike, or why even his team is not putting him in the starting position anymore, or why he's not playing in the league as much anymore. The media stance is not that you should do this, because the vast majority of watchers of media are not watchers of leftist media. Again, the structural mechanism of male-dominated fan base is one that those conservative media sites are also the ones that cover these sports the most. Fox News covers it more than MSNBC. This is just a fact, because most of their watchers are the ones that want to know about the World Cup and the successes of their individual players in terms of the male-dominated successes that happen. Just a few comments on the figurehead position. There's a lot of immense difficulty in being a captain that does this. You'll be interviewed the most, you get a lot of headlines, people will search on your background, they will even go to speculating about your gender identity, vilifying you for ruining your nation's team, and this might exist across media, right? The multitude of interpretations may happen, but you'll still be significantly uncomfortable to the degree that they're assessing your personal life. You're likely to be quoted for every single word and statement that you have. Your success and failure will likely be tied to your activism inevitably. The uniqueness of being a figurehead is that you have more pressure, you're significantly asked more questions related to leadership status and comments on your activism. I'll just give one example here. Think of how Kyrie Irving attempts to support Black Lives Matter, but continuously ends up using his advocacy to justify a distrust in medical institutions and support for anti-vaxxers. For the case of LGBT causes, it's highly likely that you will be a bad figurehead in speaking about complex topics like trans athletes or how states should change their laws on homosexuality, like in Qatar. So either you give vague motherhood statements that the community will be dissatisfied with, or you will do active harm to the movement. In any case, you'll still be overwhelmed and you will be unsuccessful due to forces of the media. So the implication of this is that you might make significant lapses in judgment, and you will still feel that you're not good enough in being this figurehead, and thus you will regret this decision inevitably as a normal straight captain of a male-dominated.
I would thank the second negative speaker for that speech, and welcome third affirmative to close the substantive portion of affirmative's case.
Thank you. Just give me a moment to sort out my papers. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, they call all of our material mitigatory, but what the opposition does not seem to understand is that our analysis of how you as the individual captain are better off applies regardless of whether you believe that your team wins or not, and whether you believe that Wales or any other or your team members actually support you or not. And that is because, firstly, you get more sponsorships because sponsors love controversy. To them, any publicity is good publicity, and that is a good thing for your sponsorships. But because you promote discourse around the issue, you promote the LGBTQI plus community and their causes, and that is probably something that you care about. In the instance where you first decided and announced that you would wear this armband initially, you probably also care about not seeming like a hypocrite and someone who reverses their decision at the slightest possible, discomfort. Those are all benefits that we claim in this side of the debate. Two questions here. Firstly, do you lose at all, and does that even matter? And secondly, what are the personal ramifications? Because remember, this is an active debate. On this first theme, opposition basically has two broad pushes. Firstly, they analyze a case where you are kept on in the game but given a yellow card. And then one line here is essentially like, oh, you'll be thrown off your game because people will stare at you. Number one, obviously, these footballers are professionals. They are clearly trained to not let a crowd get to them. And in fact, all footballers would have likely experienced much worse levels of harassment or booing from crowds in countries like England, where that is much more common compared to the World Cup in FIFA. So it is very unlikely that any footballer, either the captain or anyone on the team, would be thrown off their game. The second thing to note, though, is just obviously if he's planning to do this, the captain would just, Gareth would be expecting maybe some little backlash, but he also would warn the rest of his team that he was going to do it. He would not just roll up to the field wearing it without telling anyone. He would clearly tell his team, and that would allow them time to prepare any sort of substitutes that they need. And that was their next response in that speech, which is that, oh, but substitution may alter team dynamics. Clearly an insane claim, because obviously teams substitute all the time. And as I just said, he likely would warn them. But what's important to realize as well is that because Gareth is old, he's in his twilight era, and he's getting towards retiree, clearly the Welsh team and clubs that he plays for would have a replacement for him. They would be training up people to take over his mantle. Clearly, a substitution would not impact them in the way that they claim. The second line from the opposition here is oh, but you'll just get sent off. Firstly, we explained to you at Dhruv why this is actually unlikely. One, because of the precedent set with the German captain. But even forgetting that, because it is a bit of specialist knowledge, well, I tell you that Qatar might talk the talk by potentially forcing FIFA to introduce this rule, but they will not walk the walk. And that is because when FIFA has to take these actions, or when Qatari officials somehow get involved and demand the removal of this player, which was one of their literally one of their mechanisms, obviously that is an incredibly bad image for Qatar. Importantly, Qatar it cares a lot about its tourism. For example, cities like Lusail are built entirely around the tourism industry. That is especially important in a context where Qatari oil is drying up, and the only thing that they really can build their economy on further, other than dwindling natural resources, is this level of tourism. Clearly, they will not want to do things that will alienate and isolate the rest of the world from visiting Qatar. That is why they have made concessions about having people in the LGBTQI community holding hands and that being allowed in games, as Dhruv already pointed out. But the second thing to note is that even if you're sent off, it's radically unclear why that automatically means you'll lose the game. Can we just appreciate that soccer is a team sport, right? It does not come down to the one captain. As I mentioned before, they would obviously have replacements for him. He would obviously warn the team and give them time to rearrange themselves if needed, right? But the other thing to note is that he is an attacker. The defense line would still be perfectly intact. And so Wales would still be able to mount a perfectly good defense against any team to stop goals being scored. And they would no doubt be able to score goals anyway. The next question I want to ask in this theme, though, is does he even care if Wales loses? And there's a few reasons why he probably doesn't, and maybe even shouldn't. Firstly, he's had a long and illustrious history of going with Wales, and also is aware that Wales never wins the World Cup, that his action is not going to be the deciding factor of the game, and therefore will not care that much. Secondly, what's most important to him is leaving a legacy behind at the end of the even if there is a slight amount of anger in Wales at the moment, which I'll later prove to you will not be the case, ultimately his act will be seen as a great legacy to be left behind. And in 10 years, when he's obviously still alive, because he'll only be 45 or something, this will be seen as a pivotal or a very important point in standing up for what you believe in and LGBTQI plus rights. And even if that doesn't actually transpire, that's probably what he believes in this moment, and a reason that he should do this and does not care even if Wales loses. The final two things to note, though, are obviously he just makes more money, as we've proven to you down the bench, and as I'll reiterate, but also he does not want to renege on a promise and a public announcement that he already makes. Finally, he obviously believes that his team would support him because his team already supported him in announcing this prior to the debate even happening. So next to the second theme about personal issues for him. The first push from the opposition is that losing will make Wales angry and this will be bad for him. Number of responses. Firstly, even if this is true, this is an incredibly short-term temporary harm, because obviously he will be able to play for, he will probably play for them in the future. The anger will subside at some point and all will be good. But secondly, it is likely that that won't even occur because Wales love him. He's a literally multi-season captain of the Welsh team. There's an incredibly illustrious history there. And also, what's important to note is that in addition to being very pro the queer community, Wales has a big history of taking a stand, of fighting off the British or the English and being revolutionary in this way, probably something they're going to support. Thirdly, he can always play at the Euros when they come up very soon. Fourthly, as Niamh explains, the media will likely be positive. Note, they try to respond to this by saying oh, but not all people consume progressive media. Obviously, anyone who consumes conservative media is just going to not care about this specific thing anyway, or probably believe that the Welsh team was bad anyway because they've already said that they were going to wear these armbands. And finally, it's unclear the hatred of the Welsh people, if it even exists, wouldn't be directed at FIFA. And that is because they've already agreed, kind of agreed and understood that the Welsh team was going to wear the armband. And so if he is sent off, they would clearly just blame FIFA and not the individual player. But also importantly, there's often tons of talk show analyses of the way that soccer players work. It is clearly the case that this would still occur in this instance and would probably reveal that it is not his specific unique fault that they lost. Finally, I want to talk about sponsorships, because the only mechanism here is that he'll be perceived as a volatile actor. Dhruv already flips the example they give you of Colin Kaepernick, because actually volatile is good in the world of sponsorship. Sponsors regularly maintain kind of edgy sponsorships. For example, the fact that Djokovic still had all of his sponsorships throughout all of the drama at the Australian Open earlier in the year. But even if you don't believe that, regardless of good or bad publicity, corporations will still want to sponsor him for four reasons. Firstly, corporate social responsibility. They want to appear woke and side with someone who has taken a personal hit and a hit for the team. A good thing for much else to sponsor in the way of the Qatar FIFA Cup in the realm of being corporate socially responsible. Secondly, he already has sponsorships, and these sponsors will obviously just renew their sponsorships because it is very easy to do. And this is not actually a very radical and problematic action. Thirdly, the media that automatically attack at the point of sale when you're going to buy a sports shoe, you do not think, oh, Nike supported this one bad guy. You think, oh yeah, what company can I buy a shoe off? Oh, the first one that comes to mind is Nike. Obviously, they'll still sponsor them. Finally, yeah, as I mentioned, corporations are happy to sponsor people even if they are neutral or not great. At the end of this, we've proven to you that he gets more sponsorship, that he promotes discourse, that he wins the hearts and minds of Welsh and US people proud to.
I thank the next for that speech and welcome Neg Reply to close Neg's case.
Okay, all right, hello everyone. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. So at the end of this debate, what we can do is judge this debate on what is guaranteed and not guaranteed to happen. And then we can assess many of the evaluations on the best proven likely outcome in each of these levels. So there's a lot of football hullabaloo that went on in this debate. So it's important to parse through each claim. I guess this is not an excuse still to at least use a significantly low impact as a justification that all of the harms will simply not work. So let me just start off first. How will this happen and what will immediately happen? So firstly, the claim of affirmative is that this would largely be an easy decision to make because the other teams will support you, other nations will support you. And third half even gives the response that your fans were already socially conditioned to support you because you already made this commitment before. And all of these contingencies like substitutes and all of the stuff are already prepared for this to happen. And thus the backlash is largely controlled and minimal. So I want to compare this against many of the reasonable responses we provided to you. We provided characterizations on the vast majority of mainstream football fans who are not likely always the progressive and liberal group that you might say. We provided an illustration of this happening in the middle of the World Cup when you have already followed the reversal of your team's decision. So the timeline problem works against them. and we provided a reasonable characterization to explain that a lack of an important captain's play directs immediate pressure to you, or even unwanted pressure to you and to your team, who may not have necessarily, like, maybe they would be okay with you doing it at the beginning, but they would not consent to all of the further media controversies that may come about. And they dismiss this by saying, oh, you could just ask them other questions and direct it to the captain, but everyone is still exposed to the same difficulties of the media that we said. So what is comparatively guaranteed then? What we said is that there is a significant disjunct in the potential performance of this team and at least the minimal lack of risk that we said is more like better protected in our side when you don't do this initiative at all, and that the media will significantly put attention to this issue, whether it is positive or negative coverage. I don't know if Fox News is positive or negative for you. What matters is that the media will make it harder for you to continue focusing on your performance, and that you will find significant difficulty in finding immediate support in the short to medium term. Because again, this is the difficulty. You have to cause some disruption, and that disruption is dissatisfying for a significant number of fans, if not majority, still a significant number, that makes it harder for you to believe that what you did was correct. And thus any loss or any support or anything that you did well in the tournament will still be assigned to your regret on that responsibility, which leads me then to ask the question, what does this captain care about? The attempt from second half is to say that this individual cares less about the outcome of the World Cup and more about personal sponsorships. Third half even goes as far to say that this individual cares less about his teammate than he does care about his personal sponsorships and his future legacy. And I just want to just look at what's guaranteed again. Self-interest is complex. It includes your aspirations, your dreams, your history, your priorities, your companionship, even the role that you put yourself to being a captain, and even your image that you have to yourself and to your external self, right? What we argued to be comparatively guaranteed is that assigning your career's legacy to this activist cause for Gareth Bale in particular is something that he needing to make that his legacy for his life. Maybe he wants a legacy outside of career, maybe doing something else or representing Wales and nationalism, but not something tied to homosexuality in particular or the LGBT movement, because of my extension that I provided, that you would not be an effective figurehead. Again, something that I think was important. So at the end of this debate, we proved that this is an unlikely successful venture.
I'd like to thank negative reply for that speech and welcome affirmative reply to close.
Just confirming that I can be heard. I don't hear anything else. Yeah. Cool. Firstly, I want to discuss sponsorship, because unfortunately, as much as this negative team wants to widen this debate on sponsorships and take us down, unfortunately, throughout those 28 minutes, they did never discuss the media impact that we explained, which is an incredibly important mechanism, because this defines universal opinions. It defines how fans see you, how people who don't necessarily support football see you, how the majority of individuals see you, and they could not muster up a single response. We explained that firstly, the Qatar World Cup has overwhelmingly negative views, which necessarily means that many people, not just football fans, view upon this badly, and therefore media has incentives to view this as a very positive action, not one that is tokenistic or brash. Secondly, you can actively compare yourselves to other players in your situation that did not do the same, the ones who failed, the ones who weren't courageous, which means that you are likely seen as the best figure, the one who is courageous, who had the best morals, the most supportive. Thirdly, any negative impact is mechanized to necessarily defend yourself. So that is to suggest that even if it is true that you get negative impacts against you, we explain that that's likely at third affirmative and at second affirmative, that is likely aimed towards FIFA. The fact that FIFA was the one who handed this down, FIFA was the one who gave the World Cup to Qatar, and that's for the reason that overwhelmingly media attention on the World Cup is negative, and therefore these narratives buy into those same narratives. Fourthly, it dispels any narratives that you are a tokenistic person who's only in it for the money, which means that this impacts exist outside of the realm of football, which means you are most likely to be able to have a good life in the future. So even if, for example, Wales hates you, firstly, as I explained, you can leave Wales. You can go to the US and you can just bask in the glory of the US because they don't have any of the negative harms they want to explain, but they do get all the benefits that we claim because we say that they're incredibly positive. And I doubt that the US really cares about what happens to the Welsh national team. But secondly, you can just exist outside of the sphere of football and not have any of these impacts. Material at second, not responded. They say you might do this poorly. They also claim we don't respond to it. I would note it comes out in the last minute of second negative speech, not elaborated a third negative, but Ollie also does respond to it by explaining that they never explain how specifically this, for example, you can engage tokenistic. You can be the poster boy of Nike and not have to say anything. Ultimately, you can just put yourself next to some rainbow shoes. You do not have to engage in the genuine efforts that they want to make when you try and flip it. All other mechanisms kill this because their mechanisms explain why perhaps, for example, the media attention around you is going to be negative or they're going to be out to get you. But we explain the media attention is positive, which means they probably just want to lift you up. They want to show how great you are. Their only other assertion on this is companies won't get you because they're apolitical, asserted at 3N completely. But we explain at Ollie to no response that this actually causes controversy. It causes media attention, which means that you're more likely to get sales. And the thing to look at is Colin Kaepernick was still endorsed by Nike for huge amounts of time, even after the fact that he was, like, for example, controversial, which necessarily means you get attention. So all the mechanisms we also explain as to why companies necessarily want sponsorships still stand. So let's then describe then the impacts of this compared to the other one. They have three main impacts. Firstly, they say that you are hated in Wales. We say that you can move. They say that you want a legacy. We point to the fact that Bale still has a Euros left and the fact that you served your nation for a long time, which means it's unclear that they hate you. They call it attention that Wales doesn't do well, but you are integral to your team. You can be integral. So it's unclear why this act is the one that overrides everything else. Material at second. They then say you like football, therefore this is important. But we explain at second, you probably care about your family, your friends, your relationships, a range of other things. The money just gives you the ability to do more. It gives you the ability to lock yourself up and not have to deal with any of the garbage you would otherwise. And the only other claim is that you have a preference. But we explained that you still considered this. These impacts were brought beforehand, and because of the fact you considered it, you still like it. Their only claim is to say that there is an impact, but we give intuitive reasons that suggest that every other team would also have this impact on them, and that would reflect badly on a World Cup because it negatively impact the way the game was actually played. We dealt with the most important issue. They could only mitigate our stuff.
All right, so 3 parts as always. Firstly, some general feedback. Secondly, on the decision, and then lastly on the justification. So overall, this is a very high quality debate and also a very close debate. So my only one piece of general feedback is just a caveat that I am not a sports fan. So unfortunately, I cannot pass through many sorts of claims about the strength of X bracket or very specific details about, like, you know, legislation in terms of FIFA regulations. And I guess it isn't to say that you should not use these examples because they are obviously still useful in debate, but I think you need to sell it to me in a narrative which is likely to be persuasive to someone who does not know Article 298 of, like, whatever FIFA regulation, which means that I think broadly speaking, it's like, if you want to use an example, use it as impacting as opposed to a mechanism. Still try to have some other reasons which a general person without any sports knowledge is likely to believe. So it means I can give as much credit as possible to your claims, because otherwise sometimes I'm like, I don't know, I'm just a little bit silly. So that's just my one thought, essentially. In terms of decision, in a unanimous court, we gave this decide negative. So congratulations and then commiserations. How do we see this debate? We saw this debate was relatively clear in terms of a trade-off between the personal benefits this captain can accrue versus what happens when your performance is affected and the harms which happen there. So in terms of what happens in terms of the personal benefits, AF provides 3 benefits. Firstly, you personally feel good. Secondly, you help your community and you also encourage other teams to protest. And thirdly, on increased sponsorships. to break this down to assess how I weighed the impact of these, it was the first benefit about I feel good because I stay true to my morals. I think this is not contested. I think it is true. It has to satisfy a principled urge, which means I think side affirmative claim that as a benefit. The second thing, I'm not sure how big that benefit is because it's like not super well impacted, but I do get to claim that. The second one about you help the community and you'll also encourage other teams to protest is I think side negative line of response is just to say, well, you're likely to be a bad figurehead for the very reason that your advocacy can likely to be generalized, or for example, you take up your space from others, which is what we hear from second negative, is some to an extent mitigatory, but I think unresponsive to all the claims which side affirmative make in terms of just saying that, well, this is likely to not be tokenistic because it's thought out because you're responding to quite a powerful force like FIFA telling you not to do something, means that this is likely to be something which is quite meaningful, which is why I think in the moment, perhaps I think it is likely to be good representation. And if you do so, maybe other people are somewhat likely to jump on board. I don't know the extent to which other teams are going to jump on board, but it is likelier to have a cascading effect. But the thing I do believe from side negative is just to say it is unclear whether you're going to be a good activist in the long run. And this is a good moment for the community, but I did not necessarily believe that you would be a good activist in the long run, or there was no analysis to explain that anyway, which as a result, I think it really means you can see that it's a short-term benefit, long-term I'm far less speculative about. But I did also believe, I think Neg's weighing that this is not a unique mechanism as to when and where you can advocate. So I think if anything, side affirmative to claim a stronger benefit had to prove the uniqueness of why this is it, you have to do this, etc. The last thing which I do is they explain, well, sponsorships are likely to be affected. And to be honest, the kind of characterization about the Welsh captain being his twilight years and wanting to transition from being an athlete to activist is slightly asserted, so I'm not so sure how much cachet it has. But I think AF does give a bunch of better structural reasons to explain why it won't be perceived as tokenistic. It's like a pretty big deal. And I think Neg's response is that, well, this controversy makes you seem volatile. I think it's insufficient to the extent that you can just blame it on FIFA and explain why they are the people who you should be, targeting as opposed to this single athlete. The problem, however, is just that I also believe the concurrent neg claim, which is just that even if some people who are more progressive and pro this captain are likely to sponsor you more, I think that there is also a relatively true possibility that you lose sponsorship from people who think that this is a volatile action, or the very fact that if things go wrong in the game and you end up losing, then you get blamed for it, are also something which detracts away from your sponsorship. So I'm unclear as to how to weigh up the people you gain and the people you lose. But more importantly is the claim from side negative, which is just to say it is accepted from both teams that this is a pretty well-known guy who's got a pretty illustrious career, who played for US teams, who played for Real Madrid and things like that, of which I presume will have some degree of sponsorship. So I guess the question for me to affirmative is, what is the increase in sponsorship and why does that increase actually matter and should be claimed as quite a massive sort of benefit, which therefore means in the summary of these personal benefits which apply to side affirmative, I think it's yes, you'll probably feel good, and yes, you probably are good for the community in the moment, and yes, maybe you get some sponsorship, but I'm very unclear as to the extent of it and why it is something I outweigh over maybe the perceived harm which are likely to occur. But this is what side affirmative claims, and I think that's what they managed to lock in. Let's compare this to the harm which side negative has before we do a bit of a weigh up. So what does side negative say? Side negative's case is relatively simple, which is that they say it affects your performance. They advance 2 lines. Either you get sent off and it fucks with your performance on the field, or secondly, if you don't get sent off, the pressure is awful and will affect your gameplay. So the mechanisms we hear from side negative is second negative explains that this infraction will occur each time you wear the armband. And the first negative gives me 2 mechanisms where they cite power asymmetries and some piece of legislation I've never heard of. So what I can see from here is that there is some risk that you might be sent off. And I think if I believe the first claim that each time you wear their armband, it is actually quite a plausible risk. The way AF tries to overcome this is just to say it's not that bad because you have substitutes, which I think is true, but to the extent that side negative give me a characterization that team captain is important for morale, the particular players who can do specific sets and playmakings which are reliant upon the individual, and the very fact that other people might need to work harder, and this is an endurance game, and your performance is contingent upon that, I think it does have some sort of impact on the game. But I think the second and more important thing is the observation which comes out from the negative team that it is relatively unpredictable. You don't actually know exactly what is going to happen all the time, and the change from one person can make a difference, which is why the impact of a captain being set off, I think, has a performance on the game which is likely to be for the worse because of the centrality of a captain to a sports team. So I think that probably means that there is a higher risk and higher chance you end up flaming out and losing the match in which you chose to wear an armband in. The second kind of approach then is about the stress and the kind of effects which will occur. And this gets quite a lot of litigation and lots of back and forth between both teams. But in summary, Side affirmative's response to this is to say that you're likely to be trained. You're also likely to feel a lot of anxiety, as in trained. You can take anxiety pills, is what second affirmative claims, but at least you should be able to be okay managing pressure because you're like an elite athlete. The thing which I believe, however, is I think it is unclear as to these pressures versus the pressures which side negative raise about the stress you'll feel because this is your last kind of World Cup, or the fact that this could affect your legacy in some sort of way, or the very fact that you have made quite a strong and principled decision and it might have flow-on effects elsewhere, is also something which can occur. So even if you can manage some degree of risk, some degree of pressure, I feel it is something which is still likely to sit on your mind to an extent, although I'm unconvinced it's going to be a substantial amount on your mind. But I think the second and more contentious thing is this claim that even if there is some sort of pressure, it gets outweighed by the support you get from your fans. The problem, and this is where I think side negative quite comprehensively beats side affirmative, is because they explain, well, number one, I think side negative explains that progressives and football fans are not uniform for the very reason that it's not a one-to-one overlap, that these people are necessarily going to support you. But also secondly, they explain that media for reporting to games are often homogenous when it's Fox News because it is a particular demographic. But the third thing here is just that it is happening in Qatar, which is why it is structurally likely that you do not have your homegrown fans watching you, and your arena is full of people who might have mixed perceptions towards the idea that you're wearing this LGBT band, and that's simply because you have the board that's going to now cheer for you. Means that I do not think that you're necessarily going to get the wellspring of support that is going to be able to outweigh the pressure you feel because you made such a decision. So broadly speaking, I also believe that if you do this, it will affect your games. In the worst case, you get kicked off and it worsens the performance of your team. But during the game yourself, you also do kind of feel quite bad about yourself in a few different ways. App tries to sidestep all of this with two weighing mechanisms. The first of which is it's an easy bracket. You're probably going to win anyway. I don't know if Iran or USA are good teams, so I didn't find this one particularly persuasive. But the second idea here is that you're Wales, you're never going to win. But I think the thing here, which a second negative does and pinpoints, is this debate is not necessarily about whether you're going to win the World Cup. It's just the idea that if you do not win and you do this action, you're likely to be credited for that loss, which is likely to weigh on you and your legacy and the way in which you were perceived by other people, your team, your country, or even sponsors. And that was the important thing. So it wasn't about, we're never going to win anyway. It's that if you lose, you have probably violated something as an athlete you care about quite a lot. And first negative gives a lot of impacting as to why you care about it. You train all your life for it, something you care about. Sportsmanship is often about trying your absolute hardest in all of these games, etc. Which is why I think these weighing materials and they are unable to sidestep everything. So then weighing this, which is to say, I think there's quite a substantially high chance that this, that if you do this, it will affect your performance in the most negative. I also believe that it is a principled obligation which you can fulfill to yourself and to your LGBT fans, and that you might get more sponsorship. The reasons why Neg gets up on this way up is for twofold. The first of which is just to say, the argument that there are other alternatives for you to be an activist, you can do private donations, you can advocate in other spheres, is something which is quite persuasive in the absence that side affirmative proves a uniqueness of doing this at the World Cup. And for that reason, I think that is why it becomes a trade-off which isn't necessarily super worthwhile. And it means that you ought not risk your performance in the game and what you owe to your team and what you owe to your country, because that probably is going to be more important to you as an individual and also your legacy. And that's, I think, critically why that the benefit seems relatively small versus like everything else, which you probably also care a commensurate amount about. And there was kind of no explanation to explain why this person would care less about the teammate and the performance versus the kind of social ideals they want to propagate and kind of enforce. Means that I think this is something I ought to prioritize in this debate. Although I will say that I think the weighing here in instances were was a little bit lacking from both teams in terms of this specific comparative. But otherwise, that is how I saw the debate. I hope it made sense, and I hope it was relatively clear.